At my brother's rehearsal dinner, my mom called me a liar who never paid back a dime after I refused to pay for their wedding. Everyone went quiet. I pulled one folded notice from my coat and said, "Then read who owes who." My father went pale before he reached line 2. "What's up, everyone? Before we dive into today's story, I just wanted to ask a small favor. The channel could really use a boost right now, and subscribing is one of those little things that actually helps us out a ton. It's free, it's fast, and it means everything to us. Thanks for sticking around, seriously. Okay, let's get started. My name is Grant Halford. The night my mother called me a liar in front of 200 guests, I was holding the only piece of paper in that ballroom that could end my father's career. So she just didn't know I'd been carrying it for 6 months. The Meridian Plaza Ballroom was the kind of venue my parents gravitated toward without having to discuss it. It was ostentatious, selective about its clientele, and fundamentally hollow at its core. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling, painted the color of aged cream, scattering fractured light across tables draped in imported linen. A string quartet played in the far corner, their volume calibrated precisely to underscore conversation without ever interrupting it. 200 guests occupied the room: Philadelphia attorneys, mainline philanthropists, 3 generations of old Halford associates, and the Whitleys. The Whitleys, in particular, had been seated with the geographical precision of a peace summit, one table away from my parents, in direct sightline of the dais. My mother rose with her champagne flute at 8:47 in the evening. I remember the time because I had checked my watch 30 seconds earlier, while she was still composing herself. The quartet was playing Satie. I remember that too. She tapped the flute twice with a silver knife, and the room quieted with the rehearsed elegance of people who had been quieting for her for 30 years. "I'd like to say something about family," she said. Her voice carried warmth the way a thin coat carries heat in February. "I'd like to say something about the children we raise, and what we hope they become, and what we do when one of them refuses to become anything at all." She smiled directly at me. The folded notice in my coat pocket had been there since I left my apartment. Certified, federal, 3 pages, single-spaced, with line items on the second page that would empty my father's office by Monday morning. I had been carrying it for 6 months. 92 days earlier, a courier had arrived at my apartment at 3 in the afternoon. He handed me a cream-colored envelope with my name handwritten in my mother's meticulous copperplate and the family's embossed monogram sealing the flap. I signed for it without speaking. He thanked me. He left. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 4 hours before I opened it. Inside was the wedding invitation, ivory cardstock, letterpress, with an inner card engraved in 2 colors of ink. "Preston Whitfield Halford and Isabel Catherine Whitley request the honor of your presence." The rehearsal dinner was to be held at the Meridian Plaza, the reception at a private estate in Villanova the following evening. And my mother had written my name on the inner card herself, with a small personal note. "We do hope you'll join us. It would mean a great deal." The same afternoon, my quarterly trust statement arrived by email. I read it in the kitchen while the invitation sat 6 inches to the left of my laptop. The statement was 1 page. It was always 1 page. The line item I was looking for appeared 2/3 of the way down, under the category heading Discretionary Family Disbursements. Halford Family Contingency. $48,000. Dated 4 days before the invitation was mailed. I had been tracking the Halford Family Contingency for 2 years by that point. It was the line item my mother's world ran on. Her country club dues passed through it, her charity gala tables, her Christmas parties, her hydrangeas, her annual girls' weekend in Charleston. I had watched it grow from a single quiet transfer in 2019 into a self-sustaining tributary that ran from my grandfather's trust into my mother's social calendar, unblocked, untaxed, and unmentioned. $48,000 was a new order of magnitude. I called Natalie Vance that evening. She was my attorney. She had been my attorney quietly since the previous October. I told her what the line item said and what the invitation said and what the two said together. There was a pause on the other end, long enough for me to hear her close an office door. "Grant," she said, "they're paying for the wedding with your money." I already knew that. I had known it the moment the invitation arrived, before I opened it, before I signed for it. I had known it the way you know weather. Yakon, I said. What do you want to do? I looked at the invitation and thought about my grandfather, who had been dead for 18 years, and who had written the trust himself in longhand at a hospital bed in 2004, and whose signature I had watched him compose with a hand that was already unsteady. I want to go to the wedding, I said. 3 weeks after the invitation arrived, my mother hosted one of her Sunday dinners. I had not been to a Halford Sunday dinner in 14 months. The invitation to this particular one arrived by phone, from my mother in a voice calibrated to a frequency between concern and command. She wanted to see me before the wedding. She wanted to talk about the family. The house was, as I remembered it, Neo-Georgian, set back from the road behind a stone wall my grandfather had paid for, mosh with boxwoods along the drive, and a front door painted a particular shade of slate my mother had selected in 1997 and refused to repaint since. I parked behind my brother's Range Rover. Preston's car was new. It was always new. My mother met me at the door. She wore cream cashmere in the pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. She embraced me at the precise warmth she had embraced me for the past decade, which was the warmth of a woman conscious of being observed by a staff that was no longer present. "Darling," she said, "you've lost weight." I had not lost weight. In the dining room, my father was already seated at the head of the table, reading the Wall Street Journal in the manner of a man who had spent 50 years reading the Wall Street Journal in the identical manner. He looked up when I entered, nodded once, Sharon, and returned to the page. Preston rose from his chair and offered a handshake across the table. "Grant," he said, "good to see you." Over the soup course, my mother began to reminisce. This was her method. She constructed the family's history in real time, at dinner, in front of witnesses who absorbed the version she narrated and carried it outward into the city's social infrastructure. I had been present at this construction project for 31 years. I had watched her invent my graduations, my relationships, my professional trajectory, and the careful mythology of who had paid for what. "You know," she said, midway through a story about a summer we had spent in Kennebunkport when I was 12, "we've tried so hard with Grant. We really have." The phrase landed in the room without commentary. My father turned a page of his newspaper. Amory Preston sipped his wine. I watched the sentence settle into the dining room the way fog settles into a valley, and I made a small mental note of the exact phrasing. Weaponized sentimentality, Natalie had called it once, during a phone call in November. The phrase had struck me at the time as clinical. Sitting at the dinner table, it struck me as accurate. I glanced up at the hallway wall as I carried my plate to the kitchen after dessert. 4 photographs hung in a vertical arrangement above the side table. 3 of them were of Preston. The 4th was a family portrait from 1998 in which I was 7 and positioned behind my brother's shoulder. I had not appeared alone in the hallway in several years. I had not realized until that evening that I had also not appeared at all. 77 days before the wedding, my parents hosted a cocktail reception at the house to introduce the Whitleys to a curated selection of the Halford social orbit. 40 guests, passed hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. A bartender imported for the evening from a club downtown. My mother wore navy. My father wore the charcoal suit he had worn to every significant event since 2011, and Preston wore the effortless confidence of a man whose future had been arranged for him before his birth. I arrived 20 minutes after the event began. My mother introduced me to the Whitleys in the drawing room, between the fireplace and the wing chair my grandfather had favored. Margot Whitley was in her late 60s, silver-haired, dressed in pale gray silk. She wore a single strand of pearls and the sort of watch that does not announce itself. Her husband stood beside her with the patience of a man accustomed to allowing his wife to conduct introductions. "Margot," my mother said, "this is Grant, our other son. He's in consulting, we think. We can never quite keep up with what he's doing." Margot Whitley extended her hand. I took it. Her grip was cool and deliberate. Her eyes were the color of river stone, and they held mine for one measure longer than courtesy required. "Grant," she said, "how nice to meet you. Eleanor has told me almost nothing about you." My mother laughed in the key she used when she had not intended to be read. Margot did not laugh. She released my hand with the same deliberation with which she had taken it, and she turned slightly, not away from me, but into a posture of observation I recognized without being able to name. I had seen that posture in courtrooms. I had seen it in boardrooms. I had never seen it in my mother's drawing room. Later, while I was refilling my glass at the bar, Margot crossed the room and stood beside me without speaking. She did not order a drink. She simply stood, watching the room, with her hands folded at her waist. "Tell me, Grant," she said, still looking out across the guests. "Are you close with your brother?" "We speak," I said. She nodded as though I had confirmed something she had already decided. Then she crossed the room to her husband, took his arm, and did not speak to me again for the remainder of the evening. The week following the cocktail reception, I met with Natalie at her office on Market Street. She occupied the 34th floor of a building that had been built with tax money my grandfather's firm had once lobbied against, which I considered a small private irony she appreciated. Her office was glass on three sides, with a view of the river and the expressways beyond it. She had prepared a folder. I had prepared nothing. The folder was thick. It contained, in chronological order, 3 years of quarterly trust statements, cross-referenced against the internal Halford ledger I had obtained through a combination of familial access and private patience. Every Halford family contingency disbursement was highlighted. Every corresponding household expense was annotated. The total, calculated to the dollar, sat at the bottom of the final page. $1,412,000. "As that's what he's moved," Natalie said. "Over 11 years. Through that single account." "And the loan," I said. She opened a second folder. Inside was a document I had held in my hands exactly once, 14 months earlier, in the bottom drawer of my father's home office while the rest of the family was at Easter services. It was a promissory note. My name was on it. My signature was on it. I had never signed it. The date was 2014. The amount was $180,000. "He forged it," Natalie said, "to cover one of the larger disbursements. He filed it in 2014, and then he let your mother see it in 2015. She's been telling people about it ever since." I thought about the number of dinner parties, cocktail hours, charity luncheons, and family events at which my mother had narrated the fiction of the loan. I thought about the Whitleys specifically and what had been said in their presence over the preceding months. I thought about the particular architecture of what my mother was building, brick by rehearsed brick, toward the rehearsal dinner. "File it," I said. Natalie nodded. She did not ask when. She did not ask how visibly. She wrote a single line on a legal pad and underlined it twice. "You want it to land when the room is watching," she said. I did not answer. 60 days before the wedding, my mother met with the Meridian Plaza's events coordinator for a final menu tasting. I was not present. I learned about it from Daphne, my cousin, who had been invited along, and who called me afterward from the parking garage laughing. "Your mother wants the beef," she said. "She also wants a second option for anyone who doesn't like beef, which she says will be exactly 4 people, and she's already identified them by name." The same afternoon, I sat in Natalie's office reading the forged promissory note for the 3rd time in my life. The paper was aging the way forgeries age, unevenly, with a slight yellowing at the edges my father had accelerated by leaving it in a drawer near a window. The signature at the bottom was a reasonable approximation of my hand. Not good enough to fool a forensic analyst. More than good enough to fool my mother. Natalie had obtained a certified copy. It was now an exhibit. "Your father drafted it in 38 minutes, she said. "The internal metadata is still in the digital file he used. We have the author field. We have the creation date. We have the 6 separate revisions he made before he settled on the final version. He was not careful." I thought about that. My father had been careful about many things in his life. He had been careful about his tie knots, his speaking cadences, his handshakes with men whose approval he required. He had been careless with this document because he had not imagined, in 2014, that anyone would ever look. "When does the notice go out?" I asked. 2 days before the rehearsal dinner," Natalie said. "Certified mail, with signature required. It'll be on his desk by 11 that morning." I nodded. We did not discuss the beef. 45 days out, Natalie called me at 11:47 in the evening. I was standing at my kitchen counter, drinking water, watching the refrigerator light cast a narrow bar across the tile floor. I picked up on the second ring. "It's drafted," she said. "Final form. I want to read you the operative language before it goes to federal review." She read me 3 paragraphs. The first identified my grandfather's trust, its governing instruments, and the specific clause requiring disclosure of any disbursement above $25,000 to a non-beneficiary entity. The second enumerated in tabular form 11 years of Halford family contingency transfers, with dates, amounts, recipient accounts, and the aggregate total. The third recited the statutory penalties. The penalties ran to 6 pages of their own. Line 2, Natalie said. Line 2 is the one that will end him. I listened. I did not sit down. The apartment around me hummed with the low industrial quiet of a city at midnight. Somewhere in the building above me, a door closed. Send it, I said. 30 days before the wedding, my mother hosted a small luncheon at the house for 6 women. I was not invited. Neither was my father. The women were my mother's innermost social circle, the gatekeepers of her standing in 3 different institutions, and she had gathered them, I came to understand, for the specific purpose of calibrating the story she intended to tell the Whitleys. Daphne was among the 6. Daphne was also in the manner of people who carry phones in their handbags, accidentally recording. She did not discover the recording until 2 days later. She listened to it in her car, on speaker, while her children were in the back seat. She called me that night. Grant, she said, I have to play you something. She played me 43 seconds of audio. In it, my mother's voice, warm as poured cream, when I narrated a version of my life in which I had borrowed $180,000 from my parents at the age of 24 and had never, she said with a small, rueful laugh, paid back a single dime. The phrase arrived in her mouth with the particular grace of a sentence that had been spoken before. I could hear her rehearsing the rhythm. I could hear one of the women laugh in response, and another woman murmur a commiserating sympathy, and I could hear Daphne, faintly, not laughing. When the audio ended, Daphne was silent for a long time. Grant, she said finally, I've never heard her say anything like that before. Not at Christmas, not at Easter, not at any of the parties. Where is she practicing this? She's practicing it for the wedding, I said. Daphne exhaled slowly. Grant, she said, Shirley, what are you going to do? I'm going to go, I said. 21 days before the wedding, my brother called me for the first time in 8 months. I was in a cab when the phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. He called again 40 minutes later, and I picked up because I wanted to hear what his voice would do. Grant, he said, it's Preston. I just wanted to check in. He had never called to check in. He had called in the entirety of his 34 years to communicate information and to end calls. I waited. Mom is, she's under a lot of pressure with the wedding. I think she just wants to make sure you're still planning to come. I'm coming, I said. Great, that's great. I know she'll be happy to hear it. There was a pause. I understood during the pause that my brother was not calling on behalf of my mother. He was calling because he needed to confirm my presence for his own reasons. My absence from the rehearsal dinner would have raised questions with the Whitleys. My presence, he hoped, would smooth over whatever friction was audible in the family's internal narrative. He did not know yet that my presence was not the small mercy he imagined. Grant, he said, just before the call ended. Listen, Grandpa would have wanted you there. He used the nickname our grandfather had used for me. Only our grandfather had used it. Preston had not used it in his life. He had likely extracted it from some family archive or rehearsed the warmth of it in a drawer of his Manhattan apartment before placing the call. I did not respond to it. I'll see you there, I said, and I ended the call. 14 days before the wedding, Natalie obtained the rehearsal dinner invoice by subpoena to the Meridian Plaza's accounting office. She placed it on her desk in a manila folder and turned it to face me when I sat down. $42,800, paid by wire transfer 61 days before the event from an account designated Halford Family Contingency. The invoice itemized the charges: venue rental, catering, beverage service, labor, floral arrangements, valet coordination, and a line at the bottom for the string quartet in the amount of $2,200. There's more, Natalie said. She slid a second folder across the desk. Inside was a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet listed every Halford family contingency disbursement of the past 11 years, categorized by purpose. The rehearsal dinner was the largest single transfer, but it was not. On it transpired, even close to the most frequent, Christmas dinners, New Year's brunches, the Junior League Gala, 3 Junior League galas, the Preservation Society dinner, 7 years of country club dues, a private flight my mother had taken to Charleston in 2021 for a friend's birthday weekend, the landscape architect who had redesigned the front boxwoods in 2020, a charity auction in 2022 at which my mother had purchased a painting of a pheasant for $17,000. The pheasant painting hung in the powder room of the Halford House. I had stood in front of it once, in 2023, and considered what it represented. "She's been billing your trust for her social life," Natalie said. "For years. The wedding is not an exception. It's the apex." I studied the spreadsheet. I studied the line for the string quartet. I studied the $2,200 that would in 14 days be the soundtrack to my mother's speech about me. "File the exhibits with the notice," I said. "All of them." 7 days before the wedding, I drove to the cemetery. It was a Thursday. The light was the particular cold light of late autumn in the mid-Atlantic. The sun low and pale, the trees stripped almost to bone. I walked the gravel path from the gate to the family plot without hurrying. My grandfather's headstone was a simple block of dark gray granite. His name, his dates, one line beneath. He believed in his grandson. My grandmother's stone stood beside it. The grass between them had been cut recently. I stood in front of the stone for perhaps 4 minutes. I did not speak. I did not place anything on it. I thought about the trust he had written in 2004, at a hospital bed at the University of Pennsylvania, with a fountain pen I had retrieved for him from his breast pocket and filled at a nursing station. I thought about the clause on the second page that required disclosure of disbursements above $25,000. I thought about the specific care with which he had instructed his attorney to include it, and the particular way he had looked at me when he did, which was the look of a man preparing a mechanism he hoped would never have to operate. I did not cry. I took one long breath and held it for longer than was comfortable, and I let it out. I placed my hand briefly on the top of the stone. The granite was cold. I did not speak. I turned and I walked back to the car, and I drove home. 2 days before the rehearsal dinner, when the certified notice arrived at my father's office at 11 in the morning, I was not there. I reconstruct the scene from what Natalie told me later, from the signature on the return receipt, and from the sequence of phone calls my father made in the 90 minutes that followed. The envelope was standard IRS letterhead. His assistant, a woman named Cheryl who had worked for him for 19 years and who was trained to open all mail that was not marked personal, opened it. She recognized the nature of the document within 3 seconds. She walked it to his office without announcing it, which was her protocol for matters of gravity. She placed it on his desk. She closed the door behind her on her way out. My father read the first line. He read the second line. He did not read past the second line for approximately 4 minutes. Cheryl, Audrey, who sat outside his office, reported later that the silence in the office during those 4 minutes was of a kind she had not previously experienced in her 19 years of employment. It was, she said, the specific silence of a man who had forgotten how to inhale. When he finally called out to her, it was to ask her to hold his calls. She held them for the rest of the day. The following 36 hours were the quietest in the Halford household in recent memory. My father did not come home on Thursday evening. He slept, I learned much later, in a hotel room 3 blocks from his office. He made calls from that room. He called the firm that had represented him for 31 years. He called a tax attorney in Washington whom a partner had recommended in 2019 for exactly this kind of situation. He called a former colleague at the regional IRS office who had retired in 2021 to private practice. Each call returned the same answer. The filing was federal, it was certified, it was registered. It could be contested, but contesting it would require open proceedings that would, by their own machinery, reveal everything the notice alleged and more. The filing could not be suppressed. It could not be delayed. It could not be rescinded. It was a fixed object in the landscape of his life. And the only question that remained was how many people would see it and when. On Friday morning, he attempted one final maneuver. He called the Meridian Plaza's accounting office to reverse the wire transfer for the rehearsal dinner catering. The transfer had been made 61 days prior. The accounting office informed him, with the professional regret of a hotel that had fielded this request before from other clients in other crises, that wire transfers could not be reversed less than 7 days before a contracted event. The wedding was paid. The evidence was fixed. He did not tell my mother. He did not tell Preston. He checked out of the hotel at 3 in the afternoon, drove home, showered, changed into the suit he had worn to his own wedding 38 years earlier, and prepared to attend the rehearsal dinner at 7. At 6:45, he walked into the Meridian Plaza ballroom beside my mother. He took her coat. He kissed her cheek. He accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. He did not drink from it. I arrived at the Meridian Plaza at 7:08. I wore a charcoal suit my grandfather had bought me when I was 23. It no longer fit perfectly. I had worn it anyway. The folded notice was in the inner pocket, against my ribs, and I could feel the slight additional weight of it every time I moved. The ballroom was already full. The crystal chandeliers were casting their fractured light across the marble. The string quartet had begun their set. Past champagne was circulating on silver trays, and 200 guests were in the early, self-conscious stages of a social event that had been planned to the square inch. My mother spotted me from across the room and waved. My father beside her did not wave. He inclined his head in a gesture that could have been a greeting or a slow nod of understanding. I returned neither. The Whitleys were seated at the table nearest the dais. Margot Whitley caught my eye as I entered. She did not smile. She inclined her head approximately 1 inch, held my gaze for the length of one slow breath, and returned to her conversation with her daughter. I found my place card at table 4, 3 tables from the dais, on the outer orbit of the family seating plan. My mother had placed me there deliberately. She had placed me close enough to be visible during her toast. She had placed me far enough away to make the walk toward me feel public. I sat. I ordered water. I watched the quartet. The light from the chandeliers moved across the ballroom in slow geometries as the guests moved beneath them. A woman at the next table laughed at something her husband had said. A waiter polished a glass behind the bar. My father at the head table stared at a point on the wall approximately 18 inches above my mother's shoulder and did not look away from it. The first course was served at 7:40, the second at 8:15. My mother rose at 8:47. She had been preparing the speech for 4 months. I knew this because Daphne had confirmed it, and because the phrasing of the opening line had been audible in the voice memo, and because the rhythm with which she tapped her flute to summon silence was a rhythm she had practiced. The room hushed. The quartet did not. They continued playing Satie at a volume calibrated for precisely this kind of moment, underscoring her without competing with her. "I'd like to say something about family," my mother said. "I'd like to say something about the children we raise, and what we hope they become. Us and what we do when one of them refuses to become anything at all." A small, polite laugh rippled through the friendlier tables. The Whitley table did not laugh. Margot Whitley set down her fork. "Preston," my mother continued, turning slightly toward my brother, "has been the kind of son every mother hopes for. Steady, decent, grateful. He has built a life, he has built a career, and tomorrow he will build a marriage. Isabel, you are joining a family that knows how to love the children who love them back." Isabel Whitley smiled the smile of a young woman trained from childhood to smile at difficult sentences. "And then there is Grant," my mother said. 200 heads turned toward table 4. Under the head table at that moment, my father's hand reached for my mother's wrist. He did not grip it. He placed 2 fingers on the inside of her forearm, above her watch, in a gesture so small it was invisible to anyone not directly behind them. It was a signal. It meant stop. It meant do not. My mother, misreading the touch as affection, smiled down at him, squeezed his hand, and continued. "Grant," she said, "is a liar who never paid back a dime. His father and I loaned him $180,000 when he was 24. We did it out of love. We did it because that's what families do. And we have never in 11 years seen a single repayment. Not one. We have tried, God knows we have tried, but some people simply cannot be helped." The room went quiet. Not the rehearsed quiet of a toast ending. The other quiet. The quiet of 200 people recalculating, in real time, what kind of evening they had been invited to. I set down my water glass. I reached into the inner pocket of my grandfather's charcoal suit. The folded notice came out easily. 3 pages, creased twice, with the federal letterhead visible through the fold. I placed it on the tablecloth beside my plate. I stood. The string quartet was still playing. They were in the third measure of a phrase they had been playing for the past 7 minutes. The first violinist, a woman in her 40s, glanced up from her music at the approximate moment I rose. She did not stop playing. She was trained not to. I walked to the head table. I did not hurry. The distance was approximately 40 feet, and I covered it in the cadence of a man who had been walking it in his mind for 6 months. My mother watched me approach with the face of a woman whose speech had not yet been fully received. She was waiting for the laughter that had not arrived. She was beginning to recalibrate. My father was looking at the notice in my hand. I reached the head table. I placed the folded notice on the tablecloth in front of him, between his wine glass and his untouched plate. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The room had been waiting for me to speak for approximately 90 seconds, and the ballroom was now the kind of quiet that carries. "Then read who owes who," I said. My father's hand moved toward the notice the way a hand moves toward an object it already knows. He unfolded the first page. The federal letterhead appeared. His eyes tracked the first line, which was the case caption. His eyes tracked down to the second line, which was the identification of the respondent by name and federal tax identification number. The color left his face between line 1 and line 2. Not a drain, a collapse. The way color leaves a face when the body below it understands something the mind has not yet acknowledged. His lips moved. He was reading aloud without meaning to. The ballroom heard him. Those closest to the head table heard him clearly. The words were not loud, but they were audible, and they carried because the ballroom had become a cathedral. "Undeclared beneficiary distributions," he read, "totaling $1,412,000. He stopped. The string quartet played for 2 more measures. The first violinist, sensing what her training had not prepared her for, looked up, saw the room, and lowered her bow mid-phrase. The other 3 followed her within a beat. The silence that remained was absolute. My mother reached for the notice. My father moved it out of her reach, not to protect her, but to continue reading. He turned to the second page. The column of dates and amounts appeared. His eyes moved down the column. He was no longer reading aloud. Preston, seated beside Isabel Whitley, had gone very still. He was looking at the notice over my father's shoulder. He had seen enough of the second page to identify his own name in the recipient column for a transaction dated 3 years earlier. His face was doing a thing faces do when recognition arrives in the presence of witnesses. Isabel, beside him, was watching his face. At the Whitley table, Margot Whitley set down her napkin. She folded it into a neat rectangle. She placed it beside her plate. She said something quietly to her daughter. She rose. Her husband rose beside her. Her daughter, after a pause that lasted 3 full seconds, also rose. The Whitleys walked out of the ballroom before dessert. They did not say goodbye. I left the Meridian Plaza at 9:12. I did not take a cab. I walked 6 blocks in the cold, past restaurants with their windows fogged from the inside, past a man walking a small dog, past a couple arguing quietly on a corner about something I did not hear. I reached my apartment at 10. I hung up the charcoal suit. I took a shower. I did not check my phone. On Saturday morning, Natalie called and left a single voicemail. Everything filed, everything received. Take the week. I listened to it while I was making coffee. I did not save it. I did not delete it. On Saturday afternoon, the wedding did not occur. The Meridian Plaza issued an automated refund notice for the postponed reception, directed by default to the account on file. The account on file was the Halford family contingency. The refund became, by its own processing, a new federal transaction under review. On Saturday evening, the phone began to ring. My mother first. 3 times between 6 and 8. Then my father once at 9. Then Preston at 11. Then my mother again at 1 in the morning. I did not answer any of them. I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and let the ringing pass through the apartment the way weather passes through a field. On Sunday, the calls continued. By Sunday evening, there were 31 voicemails. I did not listen to them. On Monday morning, I made coffee. The kitchen window faces east, and the sun at that hour crosses the counter at a low angle, and the steam from the coffee catches the light and holds it in the small space between the cup and the window. The manila envelope containing the certified copy of the filed notice sat on the counter beside the cup. I had not opened the envelope. I did not need to. The document inside was one I had held in my coat for 6 months. My father's senior business partner called the office that morning. I learned this later. He informed my father that the firm was opening an internal review, effective immediately, and that my father should not come in until further notice. The call lasted 3 minutes. My father, who had not slept since Thursday, accepted the decision without arguing. My mother, in the house she had decorated and redecorated across 4 decades, he sat in the drawing room with a phone that was no longer ringing. The women who had laughed at her rehearsed line did not return her calls. The country club secretary, reached at 10 that morning, informed her that her seat on the social committee would be reviewed at the board's next meeting. The review was expected to take some time. I did not know any of this on Monday morning. I only knew the coffee, the counter, the manila envelope, the kitchen window, and the silence of a phone that had rung so many times over the weekend that its silence now was, briefly, its own kind of presence. I thought once about my grandfather's headstone, the granite in late autumn light, the line beneath his name. He believed in his grandson. I drank the coffee. The sun moved across the counter, and the steam rose and dissipated into the kitchen air, and the morning proceeded at the pace of mornings. I had nothing to do, and nowhere I was required to be, and no one I was required to speak to. For the first time in a decade, the silence of being absent from the Halford family did not feel like a wound. It felt like a kitchen. It felt like a window. It felt like mine. Sometimes the quietest part of a story is the part that stays with you. If this one did, leave a comment letting me know. And if you want to hear the next one, consider subscribing. Thank you for listening.